For 51 days in 1993, federal agents and members of the Branch Davidian religious community were locked in a standoff near Waco, Texas, ending in a fire whose causes and consequences remain contested. If you want clear, chronological history without hype, please subscribe. We will follow the timeline from the initial raid on February 28th, through the mounting siege day by day, to the events of April 19th and the investigations that followed. You will hear what official reports record, where eyewitness accounts diverge, how media coverage shaped public understanding, and why this episode continues to influence policy and public trust. Our aim is a calm, source-driven account that clarifies what happened and why it still matters. Hook, a siege watched by the entire nation. Subscribe for more documentary narratives. The standoff unfolded over 51 days outside a compound near Waco, Texas, and it quickly became a focal point for national attention. Federal and local law enforcement agencies established a perimeter and moved to contain the scene after an initial armed confrontation, and the presence of uniformed officers, armored vehicles, and tactical teams was visible to onlookers and the media alike. News organizations positioned cameras and helicopters along nearby highways and fields, relaying images and reporters' accounts live into millions of homes. The combination of persistent media presence and the unusual nature of the conflict transformed a local law enforcement operation into a story with continuous national visibility. Negotiations between federal agents and the group inside were carried out in full view of a public that followed every concession and setback. Calls and messages passed between negotiators and the group's leadership, and these exchanges were described in daily news reports that parsed statements for signs of progress or breakdown. Simultaneously, law enforcement tactics evolved. Containment strategies gave way to renewed tactical options as authorities weighed legal constraints, operational risks, and public pressure. Armored vehicles moved along access roads. Loudspeakers broadcast messages aimed at persuasion. It was a careful and contested choreography under national observation. Television coverage shaped both public understanding and official responses. Live aerial footage showed smoke and armored columns, while studio panels offered analysis and speculation. Short clips and repeated images circulated on evening newscasts and morning shows. The constant replay of scenes compressed complex legal and operational deliberations into digestible moments for a viewing audience. That compression affected public opinion, prompted lawmakers to seek briefings, and encouraged advocacy groups to mobilize around questions of civil liberties and public safety. In the weeks that followed, investigations and inquiries examined command decisions, negotiation efforts, media conduct, and the broader implications for crowding law enforcement into the glare of non-stop coverage. Civil suits and internal reviews were filed and requested, and lessons for both police tactics and journalistic responsibility were debated. Public memory retained the footage more than the transcripts, and the episode continued to influence discussions about how high-profile standoffs are managed, communicated, and scrutinized when the whole country is watching. Why Waco still divides America. Subscribe for balanced context. Federal agents went to a ranch near Waco, Texas, to execute a weapons-related warrant against the Branch Davidian religious group led by David Koresh, and the initial attempt escalated into a deadly clash. That first confrontation resulted in the deaths of 4 federal agents and several people at the compound, and it set the stage for a law enforcement operation that stretched into a 51-day standoff in 1993. Negotiators engaged with occupants while public attention turned toward a remote property that had suddenly become a national spectacle. As the siege continued, operatives from various agencies employed surveillance, negotiations, and tactical preparations in parallel. Long periods of negotiation alternated with shorter bursts of action. The FBI ultimately moved to introduce tear gas into the compound during a final operation, and a blaze swept through the buildings, killing 76 people, including men, women, and children. The sequence of events, initial raid, prolonged negotiation, final assault, and deadly fire, provided a clear chronological frame but not a settled account of causation. In the months and years that followed, multiple inquiries and reviews examined decisions made by federal agents and by the group inside the compound. Congressional hearings and executive branch investigations offered differing assessments about tactical choices, intelligence handling, and whether the actions of law enforcement or occupants were primarily responsible for the fatal outcome. Survivors, family members, and some independent experts pointed to planning failures and a heavy-handed approach. Government officials and agency reports defended the operation as lawful and necessary to address weapons violations and to bring an end to the standoff. The episode continues to divide Americans because it sits at the intersection of several unresolved tensions: how to enforce the law against an armed, insular religious community, how much force is appropriate, and how transparent authorities must be when civilian lives are at stake. Media coverage, fragmentary releases of tapes and documents, and persistent alternative narratives have kept the controversy alive. For some, the event epitomizes government overreach and a threat to civil liberties. For others, it underscores the challenges of public safety and the need to confront illegal stockpiling of arms. The unresolved questions, competing factual emphases, and human tragedies combined ensure that debates about accountability, policy, and trust in institutions remain active and emotionally charged. The Branch Davidians and Mount Carmel. If you find this informative, consider subscribing for more. The Branch Davidians originated as an offshoot of a movement within the Seventh-day Adventist tradition that placed strong emphasis on prophetic interpretation and communal religious life. Their theology centered on close readings of apocalyptic texts, with leadership claiming special insight into the symbolic meanings of Scripture. Over time, those interpretive claims became the basis for a tightly organized community that combined religious ritual, doctrinal instruction, and a communal economy. Mount Carmel Center served as the group's headquarters and daily life hub, a compound that housed living quarters, study rooms, and workshops. The complex included a large multi-room structure that members used for worship and meetings, surrounded by smaller buildings for daily chores and storage. Residents cultivated gardens, tended animals, and maintained supplies on site, while some adults worked outside the compound in the nearby town to bring in additional income. Children were present and received instruction within the community. Daily routines mixed religious study with ordinary household work. Leadership played a central role in shaping beliefs and behavior at Mount Carmel. A charismatic figure rose to prominence by interpreting Scripture in a way that identified him as the fulfillment of certain prophetic roles, and followers accepted his authority over matters of doctrine, marriage, and community discipline. Practices such as communal ownership of resources, arranged or guided family relationships, and strict schedules for study and prayer followed from that authority. At the same time, members and observers describe a range of internal experiences: deep spiritual commitment for some, concern about control for others. Tensions developed between the community and outside authorities as reports reached local officials alleging improper conduct and illegal activity. Investigations were prompted by complaints from former members, neighbors, and agencies concerned about the welfare of children and the possession of weapons. Members of the group consistently framed their actions as religious expression and asserted legal protections, while law enforcement cited investigative leads that suggested civil and criminal violations. The presence of a large number of firearms and ammunition on the compound was a focal point in those exchanges. Daily life inside Mount Carmel thus combined ordinary communal practices with distinctive religious observance. Long sessions of Bible study and public readings of apocalyptic texts alternated with maintenance work, teaching, and childcare. Outreach efforts brought visitors and converts at times, and the compound functioned as both a local place of worship and a residence where doctrine and daily routine were tightly interwoven. The mixture of insular religious practice, concentrated leadership authority, and disputed legal questions set the stage for later confrontations, but it also explains why many residents describe the compound simply as home. David Koresh and the rise of the group. If you found this informative, please consider subscribing. The movement that coalesced at the Mount Carmel Center grew out of a larger Seventh-day Adventist offshoot, and it attracted people searching for intense biblical study and communal life. Vernon Wayne Howell arrived as a member who quickly distinguished himself through detailed, often literal readings of Revelation. He adopted a new name that connected biblical figures and positioned himself as a central interpreter of Scripture, arguing that he could unlock prophetic meanings that others had missed. Followers were drawn by a mix of personal charisma, tightly focused teachings, and promises of spiritual certainty. Howell emphasized the book of Revelation and the concept of the seven seals, offering a narrative in which he occupied a unique, messianic role. This theological claim changed how decisions were made inside the community. Religious authority consolidated around his interpretations. He moved from being a teacher among many to the primary spiritual authority through public sermons, private counsel, and control of study materials. His consolidation of power took concrete forms. He formed an inner circle of close advisors who helped manage daily life and communal resources. Some longtime members became spokespeople and lieutenants. Marital arrangements shifted under his authority as well. Polygamy was introduced and justified through biblical argument, and he entered into marriages and relationships with multiple women in the community. Those changes altered family structures inside the compound and reinforced his influence over both religious practice and private life. The community operated with a heightened sense of preparedness and separateness. Members lived communally, shared resources, and followed strict schedules of worship and study. Training in firearms and survival skills became part of the routine for some adherents, reflecting an emphasis on self-protection tied to apocalyptic expectations. At the same time, outside authorities began to receive reports about alleged sexual relationships between the leader and underage girls, and about weapons on the property. These reports prompted scrutiny and investigations by local and federal officials, increasing tensions between the group and the surrounding society. Interactions with neighboring residents and with rival claimants to leadership also shaped the group's trajectory. Disputes over leadership, property, and religious legitimacy occurred, and those conflicts sometimes became public. As Howell's followers grew more insular and his doctrinal claims more central to communal life, both supporters and critics saw the Mount Carmel Center as increasingly defined by his personal authority and apocalyptic vision. The patterns of recruitment, consolidation of power, internal discipline, and external controversy together explain how a relatively small religious community came to be dominated by a single, forceful leader. Federal investigations begin. Annotations sad smiley. Refusal null, assistant. The ATF raid. If you find this account useful, consider subscribing for more impartial coverage. On the morning of February 28, 1993, federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms moved to execute search and arrest warrants at a rural religious compound near Waco, Texas, after an extended investigation alleging illegal weapons violations. The targets of the operation were followers and leaders of a religious group occupying a fortified residence, and the warrants were the culmination of months of undercover work and analysis of weapons purchases and reports of possible weapons conversions. Surveillance teams had documented activity and compiled evidence intended to demonstrate a pattern of unlawful firearms possession and modification. Planning for the operation involved coordinated tactical teams, surveillance units, and legal review. Agents rehearsed entry routes and contingency plans in order to minimize risk, while prosecutors and magistrates reviewed affidavits to support the warrants. Intelligence briefings for field personnel emphasized anticipated resistance and the presence of armaments inside the compound, and negotiators were placed on alert in case a non-lethal resolution became possible. The operation was described by planners as a precision effort, timed, layered, and intended to secure arrests and seize weapons quickly. The raid itself began with a coordinated approach to the compound at first light. Tactical teams advanced to make arrests outside the main structure while others sought to perform a controlled entry for the search. A violent exchange of gunfire erupted almost immediately after entry attempts, with agents reporting being fired upon and occupants of the compound later saying they returned fire in self-defense. 4 ATF agents were killed and 16 were wounded in the confrontation. Several occupants of the compound were also killed or wounded during the initial clash. Precise counts and identities were documented subsequently by investigative authorities. After the firefight, federal agents withdrew from the immediate assault position, and responsibility for the incident shifted to negotiators and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The scene became the focus of a prolonged law enforcement response. Perimeter security was expanded, evidence collection began where possible, and crisis negotiators initiated contact with those still inside. Tactical commanders established command posts and information channels for ongoing coordination among law enforcement agencies. In the days that followed, officials conducted internal reviews and public briefings to explain the sequence of events, while inquiries were launched into operational decisions and the intelligence that led to the raid. Eyewitness statements, agent reports, and forensic examinations were assembled to create a factual record of the initial action. Ballistic analyses, damage assessments, and medical reports were used to reconstruct trajectories and sequence of fire. These materials later formed the basis for administrative and judicial scrutiny. The immediate aftermath left the site secured by law enforcement and set the stage for a longer engagement that would draw national attention and further investigation. The siege begins. Federal agents moved to execute search and arrest warrants at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, and their approach quickly escalated into an armed confrontation. If this concise documentary account is useful, consider subscribing for more historical summaries. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms led the initial operation to investigate alleged weapons violations and other accusations tied to the compound's occupants. Agents sought to serve warrants early in the morning in order to take occupants by surprise, but shots were fired almost immediately, and 4 federal agents were killed in the ensuing gun battle. Several people inside the compound were also killed or wounded during that opening exchange. In the immediate aftermath, Control of the scene passed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which shifted the federal response from an arrest operation to a prolonged law enforcement standoff. Negotiators established direct lines of communication with the compound's leader and with other occupants in an attempt to secure surrenders and to obtain the release of non-combatants. At the same time, tactical teams and command staff worked to establish a secure outer perimeter, maintain continuous surveillance, and gather evidence from the chaotic raid scene. The FBI emphasized patience and containment as primary objectives, while preparing for the possibility of further escalation. Tactical measures used during those early days combined containment with outreach. Negotiators relied on repeated phone conversations and monitored exchanges to build rapport and to assess the occupant's condition and intentions. Law enforcement sought to restrict movement and to control access to the property without immediately forcing entry, using cordons and checkpoints to regulate vehicles and visitors. Surveillance operations included both ground and aerial observation, and teams employed technical means to listen and record conversations for both safety and investigative purposes. Meanwhile, family members, clergy, and legal representatives attempted to intervene through outside channels, pressing for access and for a negotiated resolution. Public attention mounted rapidly as national media arrived and relatives of those inside gathered outside the compound, demanding information and accountability. Federal agencies coordinated logistics, legal counsel, and public messaging under intense scrutiny, and local officials balanced public safety with citizens' concerns. Negotiations produced intermittent releases and exchanges, but the overall posture remained one of containment and careful pressure rather than immediate forcible entry. The situation that began with that initial raid thus transitioned into a carefully managed siege that would persist for 51 days. Negotiations and media pressure. FBI negotiators maintained continuous lines of communication with Branch Davidian leaders throughout the 51-day standoff, seeking to establish rapport and to secure voluntary surrenders. If you find this account helpful, consider subscribing for more concise documentary summaries. The Bureau assigned experienced negotiators led by Gary Nosner, who focused on de-escalation techniques drawn from hostage negotiation doctrine, active listening, empathy, and time as a tactical asset. Negotiations were conducted by telephone, through intermediaries, and in some instances by family members and clergy who had access to the compound, with many of the exchanges recorded and preserved as part of the investigative record. Negotiators pursued a gradual, patient approach intended to reduce tensions and to persuade individuals, particularly vulnerable occupants, to leave voluntarily. Several occupants were allowed to depart during the standoff following direct negotiation, and those releases were treated as incremental successes that both validated the negotiation strategy and created new logistical challenges. David Koresh's own communications often blended theological argument with practical bargaining, which required negotiators to adapt their techniques to a leader who framed choices in doctrinal terms. The recorded conversations provided insight into the psychological dynamics at play, and were later analyzed by negotiation experts and investigators to understand what methods worked and where opportunities were missed. Media presence around the compound grew steadily and became a persistent factor influencing perceptions and pressure on all parties. Live satellite feeds, rolling coverage by national outlets, and a steady stream of on-site reporting created a high-profile narrative that was difficult for negotiators to ignore. Public statements by relatives, supporters, and critics were amplified through television and radio, shaping public sentiment and prompting political scrutiny. At times, the publicity complicated tactical discretion. Sensitive negotiation offers and tactical movements risked becoming public knowledge, and negotiators had to weigh the impact of making concessions that might be portrayed in the press as a sign of weakness or, conversely, of capitulation. Outside intermediaries attempted to bridge gaps when possible, including relatives, lawyers, and clergy who carried messages back and forth. These efforts sometimes opened brief windows for surrender discussions but did not produce a complete resolution. Negotiators also contended with competing priorities from operational commanders and oversight officials, who balanced the hope of a negotiated end against concerns about law enforcement objectives. After the events concluded, reviews of the incident examined how media dynamics affected the pacing and visibility of negotiations and recommended adjustments to policy and coordination between negotiation units and operational commanders. The lessons identified emphasized protecting negotiation channels, managing public communication to avoid undermining trust, and preserving the time necessary for rapport-based strategies to succeed. Life inside the compound. Life inside the compound revolved around a tightly organized daily routine centered on worship and communal labor. Consider subscribing if you find this useful. Mornings typically opened with group devotions and extended scripture study led by the movement's leader, and services could occupy a large portion of the day for adults who were committed to full participation. Communal meals followed set schedules and were eaten in shared spaces, with food preparation handled by designated cooks drawn from the membership. The rhythm of prayer, teaching, and work created a predictable pattern that structured social life and timekeeping for everyone who lived there. Household chores and assigned tasks maintained the compound's infrastructure. Women and men had roles that overlapped but also reflected the movement's interpretations of family and communal duties. For example, some members focused on cooking and childcare while others handled maintenance, vehicle repair, and construction projects. Children were present throughout daily life, and survivor accounts indicate that some received instruction in both religious texts and basic literacy in improvised classroom settings. Work was not confined to domestic labor. Members maintained workshops, tended to small-scale practical needs, and operated the compound's vehicles and equipment. Security and self-sufficiency were constant concerns for leadership and followers alike. Weapons training and weapons maintenance were part of life for many adults, and law enforcement statements later documented the presence of numerous firearms on the premises as well as regular practice and cleaning of arms. Access to certain areas and to weapons was controlled by an inner circle of trusted adults who enforced rules about who could handle arms and when drills would occur. Visitors and outsiders were screened and contact with family members offsite was limited and monitored, according to testimonies collected by investigators and former residents. Internal discipline and decision-making were concentrated in the hands of senior figures, and disputes were typically resolved within the group's own mechanisms rather than through outside institutions. There were accounts of punishments, ostracism, and expulsions used against those who openly defied the leadership, and some former members described a gradual tightening of controls over personal freedoms as tensions with outside authorities increased. Medical care and supplies were largely managed internally, with group members providing basic treatment and transporting serious cases to outside providers only when permitted. Daily life combined routine domesticity with layers of religious instruction and security protocols, creating an environment where ordinary tasks were infused with doctrinal meaning and the leadership's priorities shaped nearly every aspect of communal existence. The final assault. If you find this informative, consider subscribing for more documentary summaries. Federal negotiators and tactical planners concluded that the standoff would end with a tactical operation, and the FBI's hostage rescue team began a coordinated effort to introduce CS gas into the compound on April 19. Armored vehicles were employed to position gas canisters and to cut openings in exterior walls and the roof, while agents monitored interior activity with cameras and listening devices. The stated objective of the operation was to create non-lethal conditions that would compel occupants to exit, and gas streams were sent into multiple rooms and tunnels throughout the complex. Law enforcement allowed a window for civilians to leave before the operation, and several people did emerge. Many others remained inside. After the gas insertion, movement inside the building diminished. Smoke and flames erupted in several locations almost concurrently, rapidly overwhelming interior corridors and stairways. Fire spread through the interconnected structures at varying rates, fed by interior furnishings, stored materials, and the compound's wooden construction. Emergency responders and FBI personnel on scene observed that flames consumed both the main residence and adjacent outbuildings, and firefighting units were delayed in entering the grounds because of safety concerns and operational security. When fire crews were ultimately permitted to enter, much of the complex was already heavily damaged. Investigations into the origin and propagation of the blaze produced contested findings. Forensic teams documented burn patterns, accelerant tests, and structural collapse sequences, while interviews with survivors and recorded audio and video were used to reconstruct movements before the fires. Federal inquiries concluded that members of the compound had initiated the fires in several areas, and pointed to ignitions inside rooms as key starting points. Independent analysts and other reviews questioned aspects of that conclusion and highlighted uncertainties about how rapidly the fire spread and whether the tactics used in the assault influenced the outcome. Autopsy reports and medical examinations noted that many victims showed injuries consistent with exposure to fire, smoke inhalation, and thermal damage. Some also bore gunshot wounds, creating additional lines of forensic inquiry. The scene after the fires was chaotic and tragic. Investigators catalogued personal effects, documents, and structural evidence while attorneys and families sought access to remains and records. The presence of children among the deceased and the discovery of the religious leader among the victims intensified public scrutiny and drove multiple legal and administrative reviews. Testimony from law enforcement, survivor statements, and material evidence continued to be cited in debates over command decisions, tactical methods and the balance between attempting a non-lethal resolution and protecting life once violence had escalated. Fire and national shock. Subscribe for concise documentary analyses. Federal tactical units applied chemical irritants delivered through armored vehicles after an extended standoff that lasted 51 days, and the final operation ended when a fast-moving fire consumed the wooden structures of the compound. Agents had intended the gas to flush occupants into the open for arrest and surrender, while occupants reported confinement and limited routes of escape. The sudden collapse of containment and the rapid spread of flames produced chaotic scenes on the ground and on live broadcasts, and those images became the focal point of national attention. Television networks showed smoke and flames set against the compound silhouette, which intensified public shock and raised immediate questions about how a law enforcement operation could produce such catastrophic loss. Survivors, law enforcement officials, medical personnel, and journalists gave competing accounts in the hours after the blaze. Some witnesses spoke of incendiary actions from inside, others described impediments to escape and alleged that the tactics used during the operation contributed to the spread of fire. Medical examinations and on-scene observations documented deaths attributable to burning and inhalation injury, and they also recorded traumatic injuries that complicated simple causal narratives. Investigations followed at multiple levels. Congressional committees, internal agency reviews, and independent inquiries examined the planning and execution of the final assault, the decision to introduce gas, command and control communications, and the post-event handling of evidence and survivor interviews. Those inquiries did not produce a single, uncontested version of events. Instead, they produced a patchwork of findings that criticized specific tactical choices, questioned aspects of intelligence and negotiation practice, and declined in many instances to assign clear criminal liability to individual officers. The varied conclusions themselves became part of the continuing public debate rather than a terminus for it. The national shock translated into tangible and lasting consequences for policy, politics, and public perception. Law enforcement agencies reviewed siege and negotiation policies, emphasizing training and clearer oversight. Civil liberties advocates and religious right observers intensified scrutiny of federal authority. And elements within the broader anti-government movement cited the event as evidence of federal overreach, helping to fuel heightened militancy in some quarters. One later domestic terrorist specifically referenced the incident among grievances. Families of those who died, surviving members, and independent researchers continued to press for access to records and for clearer explanations, while memorials, films, books, and legal challenges kept the episode in the national consciousness for years afterward. Aftermath and legacy. If you appreciate careful documentary work, consider subscribing for more concise analyses. The siege lasted 51 days and culminated when fire consumed the Branch Davidian compound as federal forces deployed gas to try to force a surrender. In the immediate aftermath, survivors, families of the dead, and federal agencies were left to confront chaotic scenes, contested accounts, and a flood of media attention that would not subside quickly. Investigations by federal and independent bodies followed, producing lengthy reports that reviewed planning, intelligence, decision-making, and tactical execution. Those reports faulted mistakes in information handling, coordination, and judgment without producing criminal charges against most senior officials. Congressional hearings probed agency conduct and sought to extract lessons, while law enforcement after-action reviews prompted internal changes in training and operational protocols. At the same time, questions about the origin of the fire and the sequence of events inside the compound continued to fuel legal actions and public debate. Civil litigation became a persistent feature of the aftermath. Survivors and relatives brought suits against federal agencies, arguing negligence and violations of constitutional rights. Many of those cases were resolved through settlements or prolonged legal negotiations. Courtroom battles also centered on evidence preservation and the release of investigative materials, including videotapes and negotiation recordings, which shape how researchers and journalists reconstructed events. One tangible consequence was a reassessment within federal law enforcement of siege management, negotiation emphasis, and rules governing the use of chemical agents and armored vehicles. The legacy extended well beyond courtroom and policy consequences. The siege hardened perceptions on both sides of the debate about government power and religious freedom, and it became a rallying point for anti-government and militia movements. That radicalization translated into other acts of violence that cited the event as motivation, illustrating how a single confrontation can reverberate through broader social currents. Cultural memory also took shape through books, investigative documentaries, and survivor testimonies that sought to preserve alternative narratives and keep public attention on unresolved questions. Over time, the site, the survivors, and the families established commemorations and advocacy efforts aimed at accountability, support for trauma recovery, and historical record-keeping. Today, the episode remains a touchstone in discussions of federal authority, crisis negotiation, and media coverage of violent confrontations. Lessons drawn from the aftermath influence current training and interagency coordination. And the human consequences, grief, contested memories, and the long-term needs of survivors remain central to how the event is understood and remembered. If you found this informative, please subscribe. The confrontation began on February 28, 1993, when agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms moved to execute a search warrant at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas. The initial raid resulted in a deadly exchange of gunfire that left 4 ATF agents dead and 16 wounded. What followed was a siege that stretched for 51 days, during which FBI negotiators maintained contact with David Koresh and others even as tactical and psychological pressure on the compound increased. On April 19, 1993, the FBI initiated an operation to introduce tear gas into the complex. A fire broke out and spread through the buildings. By the end of the day, 82 Branch Davidians had died, including David Koresh and many children. Survivors were taken into custody, and the scene prompted immediate investigations at multiple levels of government. In the weeks and years that followed, congressional hearings, Department of Justice reviews, and independent inquiries examined the sequence of decisions and actions. Official reports concluded that federal agencies did not intentionally ignite the fire, while critics and some survivors raised questions about tactics, evidence handling, and accountability. Legal action and public debate continued, and the episode left enduring scars on families, first responders, and public trust. The Waco siege changed how law enforcement approaches standoffs, influenced policy discussions about negotiation versus force, and remained a reference point in conversations about religious freedom, public safety, and government oversight. For many, the questions raised by those 51 days are still being answered. For others, the human cost is the lasting reality. We welcome your reflections and respectful questions in the comments below. Hearing different perspectives helps keep the conversation factual and constructive. In upcoming videos, we will take a closer look at the investigations that followed and share survivor accounts and the legal outcomes that shaped the years after the siege. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, like or share the video and consider watching our next installment on the aftermath and legacy of Waco.